John chapter 6, verses 60 to 69. We're finally concluding our 5-week progress through John's Bread of Life discourse. And as we've been discussing over the weeks, this is such an important passage to us as Catholics, as disciples of Christ, because it is so revealing. And it is so important because it is within these verses that we have the fulfillment of the scriptures being revealed and Jesus's plan for us for the continuing journey. So we know that it began with the miraculous multiplication of the loaves, and they were ready to carry him off and make him king, because here is the fulfillment of the Davidic prophecies, one like Moses who's bringing the manna back, and so they were ready to make him king. But Jesus wants to be very specific what all this means, because it goes beyond the miracles of the old covenant. It's a greater miracle, and he has to explain it to them. And so the weeks after that, we had their response to Jesus and him explaining it. And we noticed that there were a twofold explanation that Jesus gives us in these passages under the form of the bread coming down from heaven. And those two messages are, first and foremost, when he says, I am the bread, the true manna that comes down from heaven, he's talking about his divinity. This is so important to understand his teaching on the Eucharist. We need to first understand his divinity, that I have come down from heaven. And this caused quite a stir. How can you say you came down from heaven? We know your family. And so we discussed that. And the second part is what they find difficulty understanding in today's passage, and that is his teaching on the true manna, that it is his flesh given for the life of the world. And then he goes on to say, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. And this is the teaching that's difficult for them. And we looked last week in Leviticus chapter 17 on how there was a prescription against the Jewish people from drinking blood. And here they are in a synagogue, the synagogue of Capernaum, and Jesus is giving the homily, explaining the fulfillment that he's bringing about, and they're having a difficult time, and they're murmuring amongst one another. And when we hear that term murmuring, it always takes us back to Exodus chapter 16, where Israel's in the wilderness, and they're complaining against Moses and against God regarding the manna. And they want to return to the flesh pots of Egypt. And they're murmuring. And so we have people murmuring about Jesus' explanation of the true manna. So it's the same context. The next verse is critical and very important for us. And it's one that we often skip over. It's John chapter 6, verse 62. And in verse 62, Jesus says, well then, you're shocked by this? What if you were to see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? Now, what's that all have to do with? Well, we know that there were certain figures that were taken up into heaven in the Old Testament. We know that Enoch was a just man. He walked with the Lord, and then he was not. The Lord took him. So it is believed that Enoch was taken bodily up to heaven. And we know the same is true with Elijah, that he was caught up in a chariot, and he was taken before the eyes of Elisha. He was taken up into heaven. And then the Midrash of the Jewish people also say that Moses was taken up bodily into heaven. And as Catholics, we just celebrated our feast day. The Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven at the end of her life. But there's a difference between being taken, riding a chariot, and being assumed into heaven, and what Jesus says here. What if you were to see the Son of Man ascend by his own power? The others are taken up by the power of God. Jesus is claiming the power to raise himself up and to go back to where he was before. He's telling them about his pre-existence, that before I became flesh, I was with the Father. That is where I truly came from. So if you were to see my divinity, would you believe then? And then we have verse 63, the very controversial verse that really becomes the dividing point for those who believe this passage and those who twist this passage. My words are spirit and life. The flesh is of no avail. Or as some will say, translated, the flesh profited nothing. And so people like Zwingli, who is the father of the anti-Baptist movement, the Baptist movement, interpreted this passage as, because when you get to those words, the flesh is of no avail, it profited nothing, that you can interpret the whole chapter in view of this lens. That Jesus' flesh means nothing. Don't trouble yourself about these harsh words that Jesus is speaking of. Jesus gives us the clue, he says, in this passage, that the flesh has nothing to do with it. And when he talks about the spirit and life, he's talking that Jesus is speaking metaphorically. Now, this is a real distortion of the passage. Jesus does not say that my flesh is of no profit to you, it is no value. As a matter of fact, just right before today's passage, 5 times Jesus emphasizes the importance of his flesh. The manna that I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. That sounds kind of important. Take my flesh and eat it. That sounds like he wants us to do something. My flesh is true food. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. You must eat the flesh of the Son of Man. 5 times he emphasizes the importance of his flesh. So how can some take this lens and say, well, obviously Jesus didn't mean anything by the flesh because there's this one line about the flesh doesn't avail you of anything. Now what's happening here is they're taking this passage out of context and using it to disregard Jesus' teachings. What is the proper context of the flesh will avail you nothing? Well, we can see Jesus using that same phrase 2 chapters later in John chapter 8 when he speaks about how the Pharisees are judging him falsely. They're judging according to the flesh, he says, what your eyes see. You're not judging by the truth, by the spirit, by the life. You're judging by appearances only. This is a good translation. Appearances do not help, Jesus is saying. That's what this passage means. They don't help. You are not seeing things clearly. If you just go by appearance, you do not recognize the Word made flesh in your presence. You do not see my divinity. That's what Jesus means by the flesh doesn't avail of anything. That if they're judging just by appearance, they're not going to recognize the Eucharist, which is under the form of bread and wine. That's what it appears to be. But Jesus is saying that we need the eyes of faith. It is the Spirit, the power of God that opens our eyes to the reality. And he says that to understand this, it has to be revealed by the Father. He's saying that grace is necessary, that we should lean on God's grace to understand this. And so, if we're sitting here today and we believe in the truth of the Eucharist, then we should thank God for that gift of faith, that grace that God has given us. And if we are struggling with with Christ's teaching on his real presence in the Eucharist, we should ask God to give us that grace to open our eyes, that we too may taste and see, not in a metaphoric sense, but that we may truly taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Now we're told in verse 66, yes, that's John 6:6:6. The number associated, sign of the Antichrist. Those who stand opposed to Christ. We're told that Jesus knew the one who would betray him. And so many theologians will say that the beginning of Judas's fall was his denial, his inability to allow himself to believe Jesus' bread of life discourse. And he became antithetical to Christ and his teachings. And so in John 6:6, we're told that then many of his disciples returned to their former way of life. They stood opposed to Christ. They rejected the word of God made flesh in their midst, who was speaking to them. They refused to believe the good news. And they returned to their former way of life. And then the Lord turns to the 12. And this is where our first reading from the Old Testament comes in today. The story of Joshua in chapter 24. And Joshua calls together the 12 tribes at the end of his ministry to the people, and he gives them a choice. Who are you going to believe? Who are you going to follow? The gods of the nations? The gods of your ancestors? The idols of your fallen ones that have gone before? Or are you going to believe the true Lord who has given you life? This is the same decision that Moses gave to the people, a choice between life and death. Who are you going to believe? And Peter, the first vicar of Christ, speaking out on behalf of the other apostles, says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. We have come to believe, and we are convinced, and this is the key part, that you are the Holy One of God. Did Peter understand the teaching of the Eucharist yet? No. He didn't understand the full picture. Jesus hadn't even established the Eucharist yet. The institution account takes place at the Last Supper, but Jesus is preparing them, teaching them to believe, to trust in the Word of God made flesh in their midst, to trust the Word of God. And Peter is saying that even though this is a difficult teaching and I don't understand all the intricacies, Lord, who else should I go to? You are the Holy One of God. In other words, you are the one that is worthy of my trust. How can I not believe you? For you are God. How can I not believe? It takes trust. And that's hard. But to trust the voice of God. This leads us into the mystery that St. Paul is speaking about in our second reading today. The great mystery. And it's not simply the union of husband and wife, where two people lay their lives down for one another, subordinate themselves to each other out of reverence for Christ, who lay down their lives for each other, but it is in reference to Christ and his church. What the sacrament of matrimony points to is this sacrament that Jesus is talking about in our gospel, the one flesh union of the disciple with God. And far too many people are just going through the motions and do not believe what they receive. And in not believing what they receive, they miss out on the reality that it is in communion with Christ that we grow in holiness. That's what St. Paul is saying to the Ephesians. That the great bridegroom makes the bride holy by his sacrifice. That we too can say with St. Paul, that it is no longer I who live, but that it is Christ who lives within me. And so as we celebrate this Eucharist together, we ask the Lord to help us to believe that we may taste and see the goodness of the Lord.